So thanks a lot for here being able to present on stakeholders' needs towards patient preference studies across the drug life cycle. So before we talk about what are the stakeholders' needs regarding patient preference studies, I think it's important to understand who are we actually talking about, who are the key players in a medicinal product life cycle that may use patient preference studies, and why is it relevant to understand their needs regarding this type of research. So here on the slide, you see that there are actually several stakeholders involved in the development and evaluation of medicinal products. And what are they deciding about regarding regarding medicinal products? So although all of these stakeholders very much, their decisions are very much interlinked and they have roles across the drug life cycle, I here situate them a little bit across where their main decisions lie in the drug life cycle. So when we look, for example, at regulatory bodies such as the European Medicines Agency or the US Food and Drug Administration, they look at the marketing authorization level. So they look at whether or not to authorize a medicinal product, whether or not it can become available on the market. Before that, before a drug is evaluated for marketing authorization, we look at the key players who are industry, so drug developers who are in fact starting the development of a drug, and often collaborate or often also rely on academical research and academics who initiate or have a basic discovery regarding drugs to be developed, and often also collaborate on early drug development. Following the authorization of a medicinal product, it's also important that the medical product is being reimbursed so that patients do not need to pay the entire price of the medicinal product themselves. And this is a decision that is made by what Irina already has very extensively described. So the health technology assessment and the reimbursement phase. So these are HTA bodies who make a national decision. So in each country, specifically on whether or not a drug can become available or can be reimbursed for patients. And then at the post-marketing level, following the reimbursement decision, here it comes really down to the individual treatment decisions. So actually patients are here the key stakeholder who decides often in consultation with the physician, very often actually, on whether or not they will take a specific treatment. And how can patient preference studies inform the decisions by all of these different stakeholders involved? Actually, like already highlighted by the different presenters today, we develop preference studies so that they can inform all of these different stakeholders regarding what are patient views on what matters most to them. So this information on what matters to patients can be used before starting the development of a product. So what are the symptoms, the outcomes, the endpoint actually are most important to patients, can already be included before even starting to think about a treatment that targets these relevant aspects to patients. But also, as highlighted in the presentation by Mireille and Monica before, this understanding of what endpoints and outcomes are most important to patients supports regulators when they evaluate what is the relevance of the endpoints that were targeted during the clinical development of a drug. So how much do these endpoints actually matter to the patients who will take eventually the drug? As well as described by Irina, also in relative effectiveness assessments during HTA, so health technology assessments. Also, HTA bodies need to understand what is the relevance of a certain endpoint, a certain treatment feature, and this is also information that can be provided by a patient preference study. And finally, this is something we have not talked about before, but also in the post-marketing phase, patient preference studies can inform the development of shared decision-making tools between patients and physicians, so to tailor the individual treatment decision according to the patient needs, what he thinks are the most important treatment attributes, and align this decision actually with what this patient thinks is most important to them. So why are we looking at these stakeholders' needs in PREFER? So did we investigate them, and why do we consider them very important? So first of all, as extensively described before, patient preference studies, we do not conduct them just merely out of an academic interest. There really is the intention to use this information across the drug life cycle, early on until post-marketing level, to inform decision-making by these different stakeholders. As I mentioned before, these stakeholder decisions also depend on one another. So, for example, the selection of a clinical trial endpoint that is relevant to patients, and this decision is made early on and during the clinical development path by industry, but then afterwards also evaluated by regulators and HTA bodies. So these decisions depend on one another. So if the stakeholders would use patient preference studies to inform their decisions, that would impact also the other stakeholders who will be looking at the preference data, for example, submitted to the regulatory bodies and HTA bodies. So because preference studies are intended to inform their decisions, we need to look at these stakeholders, because whether or not they agree with the value, or whether or not they think the methodologies are robust, will actually affect whether or not they will use patient preference studies to inform their decisions. And finally, within PREFER, we investigated their needs, and we take into consideration their needs throughout the entire project, and to ensure that the recommendations that are developed by PREFER are considerate of what stakeholders need regarding patient preference studies. So we believe that if we understand what are the needs of these stakeholders with respect to patient preference studies, and we include these needs when developing recommendations regarding preference studies, that then the recommendations eventually found will be more relevant for these different stakeholders. So how did we investigate what are the stakeholders' needs regarding patient preference studies? So in the initial phase of PREFER, we conducted a large qualitative study among the different stakeholders I briefly described. And this started off with exploratory interviews to reveal what are the topics of their concern, or what are their overarching views, just in a very limited amount of people. And then we also performed a systematic literature review to further detail on what has been described in the literature, what has been known regarding patient preference studies and described already before. And these topics we further included in qualitative individual interviews with these stakeholders. So where we included the different stakeholder groups, so regulators, drug developers, patient organizations, patients, clinicians, HTA bodies and payers, and where we really wanted to learn from them via an open interview, what do they need with regards to patient preference studies. And finally, we also conducted focus group discussions to reveal more about topics that we did not fully capture or fully understood during the interviews. And here in the focus group discussions, we wanted to detail more about specific aspects. And then next to these qualitative interviews and this qualitative study, we also revealed the needs of stakeholders throughout the Prefer case, the Prefer project entirely. So as we in Prefer involve heavily different stakeholders, so regulatory bodies as well as HTA bodies and payers in the stakeholder advisory groups, we also reveal what are their questions concerning preference studies throughout this engagement in the Prefer project. So here, what do these stakeholders actually discuss during these qualitative interviews, and what did we find out during our experience within Prefer? So they actually want to learn more about and generate insights about different aspects concerning preference studies. And this can be divided into 4 overarching themes. So first aspect they wanted to have more insights about is the design and conduct of preference studies. So how to delineate an adequately designed and conducted preference studies. And within this team, there are several more specific questions regarding the methods and the methodology and the conduct of preference studies. So for example, how can we in patient preference studies ensure that participants understand what we are asking to them? How can we select an appropriate method to use in patient preference studies? How should we ensure that the patient sample that we include is representative of the patient population, etc. A second theme relates to the organization of preference studies. So stakeholders, aside from the methodological aspect, were also wondering about more really practical things. So for example, how much time does it take to conduct a patient preference studies? And then from the drug developer perspective, for example, when should we start thinking about patient preference studies during the development of our drugs? And also in relation to when we want to submit a dossier for regulatory approval, how much in advance should we start thinking about it? And this has been touched upon before, ideally as early as possible. But also, do we need to have an ethical approval for conducting patient preference studies? How do we go about this? What is the cost of doing a patient preference study? What are the requirements regarding translation of preference studies if we want to involve patients or include patients from different countries into our preference studies, etc. Another theme relates to the communication regarding patient preference studies. So stakeholders wondered how to communicate actually about patient preference studies. As highlighted in earlier presentations, it's really important to communicate about preference studies towards all of the stakeholders involved so that they are aware of the results. But how should we go practically about it? Specifically towards patients, we need to ensure that the results are rendered back to the patient community, but how should we tailor this communication towards patients? What to communicate to patients, and also how should we involve patients to ensure that this communication is tailored towards their needs. A final theme relates to increasing the familiarity regarding patient preference studies, and also a need to get concrete insights into how patient preference studies can be used in current decision-making frameworks. And this has been described extensively by the presentations, the earlier presentations. And specific questions that stakeholders had here is regarding their own familiarity. So how can we increase our own familiarity, proved to be an important barrier towards using preference studies? Should we use patient preferences in all of the decisions that we make? As highlighted by Irina as well, how to use or weigh them in comparison to societal and caregiver preferences? As well as how can we use them and incorporate them alongside other evidence from clinical trials. So the takeaways from our qualitative study and our experience through PREFER is that patient preference studies are intended to inform decisions by all stakeholders across the drug life cycle on what matters to patients, how much these aspects matter to patients, and the trade-offs that patients are willing to make. Another takeaway is that stakeholders require evidence-based insights from the PREFER project, but also outside, to answer their questions, so to generate more knowledge regarding how to appropriately and robustly design, conduct, and organize preference studies, and how to communicate about them towards other stakeholders. And within PREFER, we think that answering these stakeholders' questions throughout the development of the PREFER recommendations will increase not only familiarity across stakeholders, but also the uptake and the relevance of the recommendations for these stakeholders.